It's Friday, January 30th, 2026, and from the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, this is Pennsylvania Legacies. I'm Josh Rawlerson. Last year, 3 Pennsylvania artists were selected to spend their summer living and working along designated water trails in the Susquehanna River Basin as part of PEC's first ever artist residency program. The goal was to engage watershed residents, getting more people out on the water, foster partnership with and among local organizations, and ultimately to produce original artworks telling the stories of special waterways and the communities that surround them. Each residency took a slightly different approach. Sierra Weir brought the Colors of the River program she developed through her work at Three Rivers Waterkeeper in Pittsburgh to the West Branch Susquehanna. There she led groups on outings where they foraged for natural pigments and other materials in and along the river, using those materials to create art. Landscape painter Spencer Verney came to Wrightsville in York County to study and depict a site on the Susquehanna's western bank that has both historical significance and a connection with his own family history. The result is a stunning aerial vista of the Mifflin Farm, established by Spencer's ancestors, which served as both a stop on the Underground Railroad and later the scene of a consequential Civil War battle. The painting depicts the farm and the Susquehanna River on the morning of that battle in 1863. Meanwhile, Meg Lemieur, an illustrator, educator, and creative mapmaker from Philadelphia, set up shop along the Swatara Creek, spending 3 weeks exploring the watershed with local guides, leading nature journaling workshops, and collecting notes and sketches. Those experiences culminated in an elegant handmade map of the Swatara watershed, including topographic and hydrologic features alongside detailed illustrations of some of the area's native flora and fauna. And on this episode, we're lucky to have all 3 resident artists here to talk about their projects and what they took away from the residency program. Meg, Spencer, Sierra, welcome to Pennsylvania Legacies.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Glad to be here.
Before we get into talking about the residency and the work that came out of it, let's take a moment to just introduce yourselves, if you don't mind, your background, the media that you work in, and what drew you to nature and conservation, I guess, as a subject matter focus.
Well, my name is Meg Lemieur. I am a nature-focused illustrator here in Philadelphia. I do a lot of focusing of my art in the Pennsylvania Mid-Atlantic region. I've been an illustrator for a very long time. I think I started focusing on nature almost from an environmental activist perspective. I got really involved with caring for some environmental issues across the state. And I would draw the posters for different events, and it would always include little flora and fauna. And the more I got to know about it, the more intrigued I got and the more I would draw. So that was many years ago when I started doing that. And it's just developed into a complete fascination and wonder and awe for everything in nature for me. And I just communicate through my art. And so that's what I've been doing since then. So I was really excited to see this opportunity to get to know very intimately a new part of Pennsylvania for me and be able to express a care for it through my illustration.
Great. Well, Meg, welcome. Glad to have you here. Moving west now into Chester County, I think, is Spencer Verney. Spencer, welcome. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Spencer Verney. I am a landscape painter. I'm an oil painter, so kind of classical landscape painting, somewhat impressionist. I do portraits and landscapes primarily. I'm originally from New Hampshire, but, my mom's side of the family is from Pennsylvania. I kind of made my way down here via Brooklyn, over the course of a couple of years. And most of my work is essentially painting, commissions, but the work I do for shows is done out in conservation lands. So I guess to some degree, organically, I've gotten involved with the organizations that have conserved or eased or provide access to, whether it's open land or clean water, things like that. Conservation, preservation has been kind of a pillar of my career, even though it's not something I do directly. I've been involved with these organizations in terms of their fundraising events or bringing awareness to certain spaces, which isn't dissimilar to this residency. And so, yeah, this is an amazing opportunity to spend more time than I ever have in one place, and really try to get to know it more thoroughly than I usually have the chance to do so.
And yeah, I guess I'll apologize at this stage that we are working in an audio medium today, and you are all visual artists, so we'll try to bridge that gap as best we can. And then finally, over here in Western Pennsylvania is Sierra Weir. Hello, Sierra. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm Sierra. I'm born and raised in Pittsburgh. I'm a natural pigment artist and community organizer for an organization called Three Rivers Waterkeeper. My background is in biochemistry, and a lot of my studies have been in the genetics and systematics of pigments and different biological systems. And I was always really interested in what more storytelling could be done in academic settings, institutional settings, and scientific settings, because I found there was a huge gap between community, between storytelling, and between connection to place through science. So I started to get kind of into older alchemical recipes and using the materials around me to kind of create this practice that integrated a lot of different interests that I had. And there's a bunch of really amazing people that live in this space between art and science. And when I started organizing for Three Rivers Waterkeeper, I realized that each site, of course, has its own history of industrial pollution, but it also has its own color palette. So I really wanted to kind of bring that into Central PA and kind of compare and contrast the differences, because there's such a huge difference in geology and ecology and people and industrial history. And it was a really cool experience to get to meet Central Pennsylvania in that way.
Well, I think all three of you bring just the really interesting combination of skills and interests and backgrounds within and outside of art. And maybe that's kind of why you were selected, or why these projects were so interesting to our people. But kind of following that line, Meg, I want to start with you and talk a bit about your work, because you're a map maker, which is a really cool lens, I think, for doing this kind of work, in that maps can be, on the one hand, these practical, scientific, technical documents, and also at the same time, and often in the same works, imaginative, interpretive, creative works, visual art, right? So I guess I wanted to ask, how do you think about map making as an artistic pursuit, continuous with, distinct from those kind of traditional, practical applications? Where do those different modalities intersect for you, the practical and the aesthetic in maps?
Absolutely, yeah. I've been making maps for a long time, but most professionally for the last few years. And it's been really exciting to work with folks who work in like GIS maps, which are like very technical, but incredibly boring to look at, but very helpful. And then also to like be forever influenced by like Lord of the Rings maps and things like that, where it's like a part of the story, and you can use maps to tell a story. You edit the information within the map in order to guide a viewer into caring about a place through a particular lens. And so, one thing that I care a lot about is being centered within our watersheds, and understanding how water flows between us, connects us both to ourselves, like people in the headwaters versus people who are in a lower stream, and how they're physically connected, and how we're impacting one another with how we interact with the stream. But also, this water has been on Earth for hundreds and thousands and millions of years. We're connected to our ancestors through the waters. We're connected to our descendants through the waters, and we're connected to all the animals and the flora that are around us, and have been and will be. And so water is just like a central point that I like to filter so much of my work through, especially through storytelling. And a little bit to decentralize the human aspect, because so much of map making, but also so much of just culture, is focused through the lens of the human interaction. So I want to focus it through the lens of the environmental interactions through our water, through our plants, through our animals, and see those things highlighted and how they work within the water, seeing where the eels will swim up the stream and swim down the stream, where the confluence of the turtles and the owls and the meerkats will all sit, and just focusing on all the other beings that we share this lovely planet with. So I really just enjoy editing a story to care for the earth continually through a map.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the particular waterway where your project is situated in the Swatara Creek and that watershed. What's your connection to that area, to that creek, and how did that inform the concept? I guess what was the concept for your project, and why was the setting important for it?
Well, I grew up about 2 hours away from the Swatara Creek. I've visited the area numerous times throughout my life because, like, Hershey Park is there, Harrisburg is right around there. So I've been around, but I haven't been able to like really focus. Like what Spencer was saying, being able to spend so much time in one space is just a really special experience. So the concept was to work with the Swatara Watershed Association, who is the partner that I was partnered with. We wanted to highlight the streams and the waterways and also the water trails because they help run kayaking trips and fishing activities and different ways that people interact with the water. And they want to invite people to interact with the water in particular ways, in helpful ways, in caring ways. So in the map, I have illustrated all of our water ways within that watershed, and there are so many. It's really wild. And that was really fun to just like try to hit as many of the tributaries as possible in my time with this residency. And then we highlighted, I think it's like almost 30 different species of flora and fauna within that. And almost all of those species I saw in person during my residency, which is really special. And then there are 4 different points of interest that are not flora and fauna. There's special spaces within the watershed that have to do with the creek in particular, where the Swatara watershed wanted people to say, oh, I can particularly go to this space and enjoy the creek and the watershed in these spaces. And then we also have 18 different boat launches that are notated along the creek itself. And we spent a lot of time on the river or on the creek throughout my residency, which is just my favorite thing to do. So, and even like drawing while floating on the creek was a challenge, but I really wanted to try it, and it was more difficult than I thought. So yeah, it was fantastic to be able to spend so much time and get to know it on such a specific level.
Right. Well, and I understand this was sort of a collaborative project as well, and you worked with folks on the ground in the watershed. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so I worked specifically with Bethany Canner from the Swatara Watershed Association, and we came up with everything within the map together. And we did a lot of paddles together on the creek and just spent a lot of time talking about the creek. I also got to know the folks at Coco Kayaks pretty well, who are not only the people who will rent you the kayaks, but deep history buffs. They know so much and are so willing to share their knowledge. And it was really fantastic to work with them. And they're on the board of the Swatara Watershed Association. So we all kind of worked together to create this piece.
I love that you were able to have this sort of collaborative experience, and that the Water Trails program figured centrally in it. That's something that's really important to pack into power. Let me move on, and we'll come back to some of these ideas as we go. But Spencer, I want to turn to your work. And as you mentioned, you're an oil painter. You paint landscapes. What's the appeal for you of working in that genre? What are you trying to capture about the places that you depict? And I guess my other question along these lines, it has to do with, this multidisciplinary thing that I think in one way or another all of you are engaged in, because I know your project has a real specific historical resonance. So I guess how can the images
Right.
you create, sort of enhance and expand, I guess, historical knowledge?
So my introduction to painting, my mom was an artist, in New York growing up, more of an illustrator, and dad studied art history. So I grew up around the arts, but really the artists that, excited me the most growing up were, people who I knew that painted out in the landscape. And so that was something that drew my eye. But the first time I ever really got excited about the arts as something, to pursue during my lifetime would be, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when I saw the Hudson River School paintings for the first time. And the Hudson River School essentially wasn't a school, if you're not an art history person, but was a group of artists who were based approximately, in the New York City area. And they were the first collective, essentially, who developed a unique painting style to the United States. So it was like the first style of the United States that was separate from European styles that had come before. And their school, their group, had two generations. The first was started by Thomas Cole, and he was a conservationist, came over from Industrial Revolution England, and wanted to celebrate the purity of the United States. The second generation was kind of Manifest Destiny, but they both had this common theme of humans in nature, and that's something I've been really exploring more than just painting, pretty pictures of a landscape. How do we interact with the landscape? We have a small but meaningful place in the natural world, and that's something that I really try to convey. And I think that ties into my project in the sense that it wasn't just about going to this place. It was about, the people who lived there. I have a personal connection to the history of the property, which I can speak more about, but essentially it was the lower Susquehanna was the more industrialized section of the Susquehanna, whether it was the fisheries or, industry trying to cross, the widest covered bridge in the world, around the Civil War time, or, the towns that popped up to kind of facilitate travel, the Underground Railroad, crossed right through Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, where my residency was based. Really the theme of this painting is not just the place, but the small but significant ways in which people experienced and struggled with and made their living, with the space itself. My personal tie-in to this property is kind of wild. When I was looking at residencies, I had no idea that this would get so personal, and it was really fun to kind of dive deeper into family history. But the Susquehanna National Heritage Area is kind of a gateway to the history of the lower Susquehanna River. It's how people passing through can, get access to the river, understand the history of the area. But they had recently, I think in 2019, purchased the Mifflin Farm, which is in Wrightsville proper, not far from downtown. And my direct maternal ancestors were the Mifflins who built the farm, prior to the Civil War, and owned it for two generations, operated it for 30 years as an underground railroad station. It was the site of, a Civil War battle that essentially repelled the Confederates from marching on Philadelphia, crossing the covered bridge. And so it was fascinating to me on a personal level. But then how do you convey all of that in a two-dimensional image?
Yeah, actually, that leads nicely into the next thing I kind of wanted to explore a little bit. And we'll put an image of this on our website along with it so people don't have to just imagine what we're discussing. So we don't need to spend a lot of time just describing the painting, but I did want to bring up some of the visual details because a couple of things stood out to me in your notes for the piece. One of them, as you just explained, is this very specific historical moment that you're depicting in this very specific place, and also that sort of first impression of the canvas is it's like 2/3 of it is sky and clouds, which is sort of interesting in itself. But you talk about why you chose an aerial point of view for that, which, I mean, to me, like, I'm not versed in art history enough to say with confidence, but my guess would be you don't see a lot of aerial landscapes prior to like the 20th century, right? So anyway, I bring it up just because
Sure,
it's one
yeah.
of several ways in which you're using the composition of the painting to kind of bring together all these ideas that are in play in the piece, some of which you just mentioned.
So you're totally right. So the lower third of the painting is the landscape, and it's an aerial perspective overlooking the farm. The Susquehanna River is, going, left to right, right, near the horizon, and then you can see the far bank, and it kind of disappears into the atmosphere. And then the upper part of the painting is, kind of these towering, Pennsylvania, summer, early afternoon clouds. And the concept behind those choices, the aerial perspective was a practical way to see more of the Susquehanna River from the farm. Before starting this residency, I really hadn't had much opportunity to walk around on the farm. And although it's, less than a mile from the banks of the Susquehanna and was, constantly involved, the farm was very involved with the river itself. It was hard to kind of convey that from a ground level perspective, but actually raising the viewpoint of the painting, and setting it back, a bit so you can actually see the farm, in the foreground, I thought added this kind of surreal element, where you're kind of floating above the ground, and then producing, 2/3 of the painting as sky. I love painting skies, but I thought this was also an opportunity to add more kind of surreal, nature to it. The whole looking from the banks of Wrightsville, where the farm is, eastward towards, the far bank, and then, Philadelphia, in the distance. Those were aspirational, destinations to people. Those, whether you were stopping in this farmhouse as a freedom seeker, on what would eventually become known as the Underground Railroad, or you were a Confederate soldier who was marching to try to take possession of the bridge and march on Philadelphia. These were aspirations, and so I thought that was something significant to try to depict, but I guess somewhat in a surrealist way, if that makes sense. I didn't want to be too on the nose with any of this stuff, and paint the faces of people in the sky or anything, can't be like that. So, and then the other key parts of the composition, I went with a circular composition where there are light shapes on the field, that are, where the clouds are allowing the sunlight to shine through. And those light shapes actually kind of produce almost a U shape, and the circle continues up along the edge of the clouds over the top of the painting. At the top, there's a light shape on the top of the cloud, and down and around. And a circular composition is a classical composition. It also leads your eye around, so you don't get, you get led through the painting, so to speak. But the light shapes on the ground on the left, so from the farmhouse looking, up to the horizon on the left edge of the painting, that's actually the path that the freedom seekers would take from the farmhouse in the evening as it started getting dark. And that's where, and the light on the river there is where they were rowed across, in complete darkness to avoid the bridge and, slave catchers on the bridge. And so I thought that was a path that needed to be illustrated. And then if you look from the barn up to the edge of the painting, the horizon on the right, that's actually the site of the 45-minute long skirmish itself. So, so I was trying to kind of point out these important elements without being too on the nose with it, I suppose.
No, you managed to get it all in the frame in one vista, and in order to do that, you had to adopt a vantage point that would not have been available to anyone living at the time that you're depicting, right? Meanwhile, you trying to study this landscape from ground level in 2025, can't see it also because of development and the landscape has changed.
Exactly. And so the barn and the house and the structures on the property, as well as actually the outline of where the fields are in this painting, is actually how it would have looked in the period of significance. So, on the morning of the Civil War battle, this is how the barn would have looked. Which the main structure is still there. There's just like a dairy barn that's been added onto the side. So I removed that and kind of put the row crops like corn into something more like wheat, which it would have been more applicable. And then using Penn State Extension has these great libraries of historical aerial photographs of Pennsylvania, for agricultural surveys. And the earliest of which were actually, black and white wet film photos that were taken from very high altitude, but they're very high resolution on crystal clear days. And those were I think the earliest ones I could find were in like 1937 or something. And then you compare that with, hand-drawn maps of the town from pre-Civil War, you can kind of figure out roughly where the fields would be. So then I had to kind of imagine all of that from more of like a 30-degree angle, not a, straight up and down angle, or not a ground level angle. So trying to make all of that work was a fun challenge, but I thought it was cool to try to imagine the property in the most significant period, in its history, rather than, in today's kind of fallow form,
Yeah. I love how the present is also present, I guess, even in that vantage point. Beautiful piece. Well, let's move on to Sierra and shift gears, I guess. Sierra, I know that your day job is with Three Rivers Waterkeeper, which is an organization I'm familiar with because I'm in Pittsburgh as well. But for those who are not, tell us a little bit about Three Rivers Waterkeeper, what you do there, and how that work connects with your interests as an artist. Did art lead you to conservation or vice versa or something else?
Yay, Pittsburgh, first of all. Yeah, Three Rivers Waterkeeper is a nonprofit that is a part of the Global Waterkeeper Alliance. And so our mission and vision is to keep the three rivers, the Ohio River, the Allegheny River, and the Monongahela River, fishable, swimmable, drinkable. And the goal of the Waterkeeper Alliance is to hold polluting industries accountable so that, we can remediate a lot of the harm that's been done to our waterways here and kind of move forward with cleaner practices that we can sustain for everyone, plants, animals, and humans for as long as we possibly can, for forever. And we're a really small group. We only have about 10 employees, staff members, and I've been with them for about 2 years, and I've come into this role as a community organizer. There was a really big learning curve, honestly. I grew up here, but I had to start interfacing with the environment in a much different way. So I became aware of a lot of systemic issues very quickly, and I was like, oh, this is really bad. There's just so much work to be done. And there's so many people that have been doing really amazing work organizing around and advocating for the health of our environment and themselves. And it's just been really amazing to learn from them. And I guess I was like, well, what can I offer? I don't know. There's a lot of incredible work already happening. And I decided to propose that I start a program with Three Rivers Waterkeeper that would pull in some of this artistic research that I was kind of doing on my own time. So I thought a cool way to engage people that isn't so doom and gloom is like art and color and just interfacing with the river itself, and kind of to create a different experience than people might conventionally have or most often have with our rivers, which have been known as very polluted and very dead rivers. And the executive director was like, yeah, go ahead. And I started to study art-based perceptual ecology, ABPE. Dr. Lee Ann Woolery, a biologist, developed, and she has all kinds of really incredible protocols that focus on unconventional ways of researching the environment and ecology and biology. And so with my pigment background, communication, I thought it would be a really good opportunity to try out to people, and bringing people out to our waterways with a colorful, I don't want to say a colorful twist, but that's exactly what happens. I'm like, yeah, come play with me. And then we can learn a lot about, ourselves and how we're showing our existing beliefs, and then also how that waterway came to be. And everyone gets to practice their deep noticing skills and paying attention to the waterway. And everyone comes out of it with really interesting findings and perspectives that I could never have had on my own. It's like a really incredible collective experience.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those it's about process as much as product. It's about all of you out there exploring the space, and then something comes out of it that's maybe greater than the sum of the parts or whatever. I love that there is a name for the thing I'm struggling to put my finger on, ABPE. I'm going to have to look it up. I guess I wanted to ask you, because I saw in your LinkedIn bio, you identify yourself as an anti-disciplinary scientist, which I found fascinating and provocative. So I guess I want to ask you a similar question that I asked Meg, to the extent that you're also engaged in a kind of map making, a kind of storytelling through documentation. How do you think about the interplay between those like the descriptive and the interpretive mode of representation that you're doing as an artist, or as a scientist? Are you using, scientific knowledge as inspiration for creative work, or are you using creativity as a means of data visualization, or is it sort of all of the above? How do you think about that?
Yeah, data itself can be a lot of things to a lot of different people, but I've been really enjoying expanding my own understanding of data and how your subjectivity, how you show up, cannot be ignored with whatever you create, with whatever you produce, whatever you are testing. You are an inherent part of this environment, and it's just got so many multitudes and so many dimensions that's part of the anti-disciplinary framework, is that it cannot really be confined while ignoring all of these other things. So kind of like dissolving all of these constraints to get a more broad picture that both like acknowledges and pulls in all of these different perspectives that have been grown and shared over thousands and thousands of years, and even millions of years, and trying to kind of listen to and communicate with the voices of non-human beings, and how you can be in relationship with them, how you can collaborate on something with them. And then, yeah, that process becomes so incredibly important. And then, the scale kind of balances out whenever you create a final piece. So I've never considered myself really a painter or an artist. It's just kind of like a product at the end of my process. And it's really cool hearing Spencer talk about all of these compositional choices. And it's like, well, mine, I don't know. The rocks told me to do that. No, I'm just kidding. But I ended up making a painting that has a couple of different pigments that I collected from different tributaries and the west branch of the Susquehanna, from the perspective of sitting in the creeks. So it's has less actual water in it, but it gave me the feeling of being held and just being at the bottom of this valley. And what you see whenever you feel that in your body, as opposed to what you are intellectualizing about what you're seeing. Working with non-human materials is an essential part of, like Meg and Spencer are talking about, this kind of deprioritizing humans and industry and technology, and kind of placing us on the massive geologic scale, that we are in, with a better size comparison, because we are so small. And we have to kind of acknowledge all of the thousands of years of communication and history and movement that is in and around us. And I think working with pigments is such an easy way into that voice.
Let's bring it back to all three of you. And the one thing that you all very specifically have in common is that you were participants in this residency program. And that's sort of the one thing we haven't really addressed square on. But I would like to hear from each of you about, how you went about these projects in that context, What was it about this arrangement that made the work possible, or what effect did it have on the work? Because like this is, I don't know how typical this is of the way you each normally work, but it's a period of sustained focus in a particular space.
I can start. While I was creating my map, I wanted to spend a lot of time on the creeks, on the tributaries within the area of the watershed as much as I could and to get to know it as much as I could. So I hiked trails, I explored the parks pretty extensively. I read a lot of books about local history, both recent and deep history, geological history. I kayaked a lot, combed through museums, talked to all sorts of folks about the watershed wherever I could, really. And I also held a couple nature journaling events that were open to the public. And that was really wonderful because people came out and we spent time intentionally creating art, but also creating just pages of observation of the natural world around us. I was able to guide those and get a lot of information from the folks who showed up to those events, about how they interact with the watershed as well, and what they're excited about, and maybe what would be interesting to include in the map. And so being able to spend so much time uh, having a personal experience is just my absolute favorite way to do any kind of art, because it just makes it so personal for me. And it really, when my heart is in a piece, you can just feel it. It just makes the whole thing better. When I'm pumped about something, I'm just going to pour 150% into everything that I do. So, so I really wanted to spend the time to make it just a beautiful place, a beautiful piece, and work with Bethany, to make the map a tool that they can continually use from here on out to invite people to interact with the water trail and to different parts of the watershed. So being able to spend so much intentional time, just it opened my eyes, but it also opened my heart to this area in a really cool way.
Spencer, what about you? You talked a bit about the process and what it was like working on the piece, but what did you take away from not just the work but the experience of creating it over time in this particular context?
Yeah, no, I think what Meg said was absolutely on point. And then Sierra a minute ago was just mentioning process over product, and I think that's something I've really tried to focus on with my work. And I think this residency provided a period of time that I'm usually not afforded with these projects, to actually just go sit in the field. I mean, the farm I was working on primarily was, the fields were, planted with crops, but there was no activity going on. They're in the process of, fundraising to develop a cultural center there, a history center, an art museum, but it's fairly inactive. And so I just had the opportunity to go out there and eat my lunch on the porch of this old house and walk around and kind of explore the property. And that alone is really unique. And yeah, I think it allowed me to go and sketch the place from a million different angles. And just like Meg said, take the time to really figure out what excited me about it. Because, when you're producing something, I don't know, I suppose it's maybe anything you're producing, but art specifically, if you're really excited about it, if you're fully engaged, if you kind of get that tailwind behind you, your work's just going to be that much better. It's going to show, and you can't fake that. It has to be authentic. So time is definitely something that I think too much of it, you can get lost in your own thoughts and kind of forget where you're going. But to have the luxury of just being able to like chew on a place for a series of months and again, like Mike said, talk with people. There's a whole trail network that goes by the Zimmerman Center, which is it's not the main office, but it's kind of the headquarters of the Susquehanna National Heritage Area. It's an incredible resource. It has all of these historic displays that talk about the history of the river and current inhabitants, and all the way back to the native tribes that were there, and every bit of historical, industrial, data in between. It's just an amazing opportunity. I think the time for me was really the biggest luxury.
And Sierra, I know maybe your situation is a little different in that Colors of the River pre-existed this residency, but could you talk a bit about how the program sort of evolved as a result of coming at it in this slightly different way?
So I had big plans at the beginning of this residency, but I had to pivot towards the end for a couple of different reasons. So yeah, Colors of the River, it did exist, but it would have produced, I would imagine, totally different results in a totally different place with different people, different waterways, different history. However, one of the main differences in Central PA versus Southwestern PA are all of the conservation laws, which is really amazing. I'm so happy that Central Pennsylvania has all of these state parks, state forests, and all of these restrictions for foraging and for taking trips. But that made it very difficult for me to get the programming set up at all. And it took multiple months to find who to ask about which permit to apply to, and then a couple of months for the permit to be approved, and whether that's, DCNR, PA Fish and Boat Commission, whether it's municipal, state forest, state park. And I think I scouted over 24 access points along the West Branch and tributaries to find even where the program, I think, could be successful. And then within those, I had to prioritize, which ones would be the best, who owns that property, and then how do I get permitting around that. And then that process took so long and was so different than what I experienced here in Southwestern PA that the programs weren't ready to be planned and advertised until October. And by then, it was getting dark really early and it was cold. And I tried to put on programming both at municipal launches like in Montoursville, but also some more rural ones like Kettle Creek. I did end up having one program, but because I was having trouble getting people out, I had to pivot a little bit towards the end. So even though it was technically unsuccessful, I learned so much. It was a whole new way of, relating to our waterways. And it is really incredible that, I walked into a state forest office asking for a permit about foraging for rocks. And she's like, oh, so you want a mining permit? It's like, no, I don't really want to mine anything, but it seems like that would be easier to get at this point.
So you're doing really resource extraction out there, Sierra.
You know me, I'm just taking all of the things that I find. No, I take as little as possible. I, use what, take what you can use, return what you don't. And even then, it's a very little amount, and you have to spend a lot of time with the people and with the places before even pursuing using any natural materials. So there was just like, yes, I am so grateful that I had all of this time to figure it out, and I would like more. I need like a year and 4 seasons. But I did get a lot of support, from PEC and the Susquehanna Greenway Partnership, and I ended up being able to do 3 outreach events over the course of 3 days in Lewisburg and Bloomsburg, and talk to a lot of people in towns all along the West Branch.
We're going on an hour here, folks. I really appreciate your hanging in there. This is fascinating. You could go on probably all day with this, but we should wrap it up. So let me just say, Spencer Verney, Meg Lemieur, and Sierra Weir, thank you so much for your time today, and thanks for sharing about your amazing work.
Thank you so much.
It was great to hear from you.
Thank you very much.
You You can get a look at the original artworks that came out of last year's residencies in the show notes for this episode. You can find the post at pecpa.org. While there, learn about PEC's work supporting our state's rivers and streams and the local groups who care for them. We do that work through the Pennsylvania Water Trails Program, administered by PEC in partnership with DCNR, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, and the National Park Service. We also provide capacity and technical support for community watershed organizations statewide through our affiliate, the Pennsylvania Organization for Watersheds and Rivers, also known as POWER. And we're proud to work with DCNR on the popular Pennsylvania River of the Year program, which gives Pennsylvanians a chance to nominate and vote for their beloved neighborhood waterways, to receive bragging rights and funding for a year's worth of celebratory events and educational activities. And by the way, the winner of this year's River of the Year competition, announced just yesterday, is the Conestoga River in Berks and Lancaster counties. The Conestoga is, in addition to being Pennsylvania's 2026 River of the Year, one of our 29 official water trails, recognized as exceptionally well-suited for paddling and other low-impact recreation activities. You can find more on water trails, River of the Year, and POWER at pecpa.org, pecpa.org, where you can also make a much-appreciated donation to support these programs and all of PEC's work to protect, restore, and celebrate Pennsylvania's outdoor treasures. That's all for now. Keep an eye on your podcast feed for the next episode of Pennsylvania Legacies. Until then, for the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, I'm Josh Rollerson, and thanks for listening.